What's good, everybody? My name is Alckemy, and today we are going to be talking about a beginner's guide to mixing. Mixing pretty much comes down into four things for me: volume, frequency, stereo, and context. I'm going to cover context first, because if you don't have something that makes sense, or you don't have something that's cohesive in the first place, you have a billion kicks that are layered over each other, a billion bass lines, thousands and thousands of layers or something to that point. If the story or the concept isn't strong enough in the first place, then it's only going to hurt the mix in general. The mix is designed to improve the idea, not save the idea. So, focus more so if you're a beginner on making cool concepts, and then look at mixing before we even jump into the other stuff. Frequency, stereo, and volume. These three ingredients are what is needed to make the perfect little mix. Except for when you add chemical X. If you get that, then you're probably old like me. So within this, I want to talk about a couple of tools that you can solve in which to look at, or I guess analyze, those key aspects about like what makes a mix in the first place. So when it comes to frequency, you want to look at something like an EQ, preferably a parametric EQ, because what it will do is give you a visual representation or a spectral analyzer of what is happening from 0 hertz all the way to like 20, 30, 40K, depending on what it is that you're using and how you're looking at it. So basically, if I were to play a sound, it would sound like this. I'm going to turn this off for a second. And what this is doing is showing me all the kind of frequency content that the sound is displaying. Now, if I were to introduce something artificially, let's say I've got, this little peak here, and then I'm going to turn this off and pull up a secondary EQ, and I'm going to show you why in a second. If I have something that's like absolutely crazy, which something like this, you can hear that there's this crazy little peak that's coming out. And so what I can do to fix that is turn this on and solve it in that way. And this is what you would be calling subtractive EQ. This is where you identify or analyze, anything that is like too far out of the ordinary, and you try to use an equalizer or so in which to control it. There's a lot of other tools that you can use. For example, you can do like multi-band multi-band compression and all that other stuff. But I would urge you to reach for an EQ first before you get into all of the other crazy plugins. Now, likewise, as a sound design thing, you can also boost specific frequencies if you want to. Right, that's something that you can use to make your basses a little bit bigger, or you can create movement and this becomes a filter, but that's a whole different thing. But generally speaking, frequency is just looking at something from, the entire frequency range, again, of 0 to say 20K, and saying, all right, does this have some kind of consistency, or does it have a general shape or slope to basically like reference in general? Now, frequency also comes into a lack of frequencies as well, to where you can use an EQ to boost things, but you can also do something like distortion. So if I were to use something subtle like an overdrive or a saturate, which is what I would recommend for creating what we call warmth, it's almost self-explanatory. It makes it sound a little bit warmer. I think it focuses on even harmonics. It might be odd harmonics, but it's either one or the other. I don't remember. But basically, warm is one set of harmonics, and then cold and metallic is the other set. When you're making something warm, you want to use something like overdrive or saturate, because it's going to thicken the sound. Now, within this, having subtle aspects of distortion is great for sounds that might seem kind of weak. And it's not always necessarily a volume case. It's literally like it sounds thin and sounds, I guess, fragile. So by using small amounts of distortion, you can thicken things up. And that's how you can kind of approach mixing from a frequency perspective. The next thing that we want to talk about is stereo, which pretty much lies into a left and a right channel. So left and right. What defines stereo is the difference between a left and right channel. So you've got a mono signal, and then you've got your left and right. You've got other stuff too, like mid-side, but we'll talk about that in a different video. But basically, if you want something to sound wide, then you want to create some kind of stereo image. So for example, if I turn the spread down on this and we were to pull up this imager here, everything is completely in mono. If I were to spread it out, you can see that between this mono signal here, that everything is kind of, I guess like kind of phasing. That's the keyword here, phasing between the left and right channel. Now, normally this would be totally fine, but the only thing that you really want to focus on is what's called phase cancellation, and only in the low end. The reason why is because if you've got a bunch of stuff, first of all, phase cancellation is introducing silence in an unwanted way. We can talk about waveforms and all that and about how they match and blah, 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 but you can look up any other video on what phase cancellation is. But basically, you're creating unwanted silence because it's doing what's called phase cancellation and canceling the waveforms out. One example of this is if you pay attention to the low end and how thick it is and how it sounds, we can just turn the spread down, right? It sounds nice and beefy. If I were to use something like a Haas effect on the entire signal, then you can see that as this crosses below 0, we're introducing phase cancellation, and while it might sound louder, the low end has been lost, and that's what you want to be mindful of. So generally speaking, around 120 hertz, you want it to be relatively mono. You can still have a little bit of stereo in it, but you want to focus on like not having phase cancellation. And then as you get higher up in the frequency range, it's generally okay. But other than that, when it comes to stereo stuff, I guess one thing that I can tell you about is like if you're using reverb, the further away a reverb is, the darker and more linear it should be because of how our ears perceive sound and because of how sound travels, at least on planet Earth. So what I mean by that is if something is really far away, it's going to sound like it's really dark and it's going to sound like it's coming from one direction. Whereas if something is really close, then it can be super duper wide and whatnot because we're being surrounded by the sound, and it can also be really bright. That's just for like realistic sense, but like there's not really any rules to it. It's just how I approach reverb in general. So when it comes to that kind of stuff, you can do that. If you want to make sounds more wide as well, you can look at phasers and flangers, anything that is a stereo processor. You can use the Haas effect, which creates a delay in between the two, but again, just be mindful about what's happening on your low end. Aside from that, you can do something like mid-side EQ, to where you're only affecting the middle signal and then the side signals separately. But again, we can talk about that in a different video. All right, so the last thing that we want to talk about is the most important, which is volume. Most of your mixing is going to be having a relationship between the volumes of all of your different sounds, which creates dynamics within your tune. Bass music is a little bit easier because you usually just crank everything up, but I'm very quickly going to tell you about two things that's going to make this extremely helpful. One, gain staging is not as important, but also more important than you might think. But the way that I gain stage is a little bit different, which goes to giving credit to bathymetrics, which is the clip to zero. I use this tool called Newfangled Saturate to help me with dynamics, which what I do is I clip everything like really hard. And then at the end of it, I have this auto gain here to where if I'm clipping something, we'll talk about clipping here in just a second, but if I'm clipping something, it's going to reduce the gain, and that is my gain staging before it hits the limiter. So a limiter, compressor, maximizer, usually even a clipper, a hard clipper in general, does both distortion and deals with volume. But these things are tools to help control your levels. You can also just use a fader if you want. If something's too loud, just turn it down. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But what I try to do is basically throw everything into a clipper and then adjust the volumes after that. And the reason why is because if everything is brought up to zero and it's all nice and cut off and everything has these nice transient list waveforms or whatever, then I can start to have more consistent leveling. So if you kind of push everything through this, or you can push everything into individual limiters. So let's say I have this sound and I use something like Pro L. You can talk about the pros and cons of using a limiter versus a clipper, but they're basically going to push something to a ceiling. So for example, if I have this sound and we look at what's happening here, if I were to push this up, it's going to push it to 0 dB. Likewise, if I have something like a clipper and I turn off auto gain, there's going to be a certain point of this drive here that it's theoretically going to do the same thing, where it's going to push it to 0. So they're very similar in that way. The process is different. Don't think that these are the same tools, but they're achieving the same results. However, once you have something like this to where everything is kind of like at that 0 point, then that's when I go in and use something like auto gain and begin to turn it down in relation to, all the other stuff. Remember, in order for you to even mix, you have to have something that is comparable, right? So you have to like put one sound against another in order to even consider a mix. And usually you need at least a few to kind of see the big picture. However, I will say that just as a general thing, because I think that a lot of people are going to ask about this, I usually set my bass to be 2 decibels more quiet than my kick. That's just my mixing philosophy. That's just kind of like my strategy about how I do things. For example, this is a track that I'm working on. It's not finished by any means, but this will kind of give you a relationship about what kind of sound or what kind of energy I'm going for, at least as far as the low end. We're just going to wait for this to load for a quick second, and then I'll just quickly play. But while this is loading, really you want to just focus on controlling your levels. That's the biggest thing when it comes to having a decent mix, is just leveling stuff. If your snare is too loud, it's going to kind of overpower the mix, and you're going to just feel like you're hearing a tone on every other offbeat or something. If your kick is not loud enough, then it's going to lack the energy to carry, the beat of the tune. If, your bass stinks, then you're going to lack power, blah, blah, blah. If your bass is too loud, it's going to swallow all of the other sounds. But, basically I try to aim for something that's kind of like this. Now, obviously, this sounds a little bit rough and it's very clipped to death, but I kind of like that sound to where it's a little bit more raw. And there's, certain things about it that I could definitely improve on. But in regards to the kick and bass relationship, I'm very happy with that. That works for me, and that's something that will hopefully work for you. But as a recap, you are pretty much only dealing with 4 aspects, and then all of the tools that are mixing tools that come into play are pretty much some kind of thing that either deals with frequency, volume, or stereo processing. And once you kind of have that, then, I wouldn't say that you're a mixing genius, but it's going to kind of give you all of the hints you have, or all the hints you need in which to make, something that's at least decent before you either send it out, or before you, have like a dedicated, study journey on mixing itself. But in essence, this is your crash course. I wanted to do something because I recorded this video a long time ago and it only uploaded in 360p. So if you guys like the video, then be sure to like and subscribe, and hopefully you learned something. Let me know your mix tricks down below, and happy mixing.